Daniel, welcome to the show and thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me.
So Daniel, your book, To Sell as Humans, been referenced on this show loads and loads of times. I still love the idea of Norman Hall as the last Fuller Brush man ever out there. And your ABCs of selling, attunement, buoyancy, and clarity, they still resonate today. Let's just talk about that one very quickly. What prompted you to write To Sell as Human back in the day?
Well, it was a few things. Number one, as I realized that I was selling all the time myself, not necessarily selling books, but just persuading and influencing all the time. It was a big part of my life. The second is that having at that point I had been writing about business for about 15 years, and what I noticed was something really peculiar. Is that out in the world, the sales profession had a certain reputation,
Yeah.
and it was completely divorced from the reality of all the salespeople that I knew. That the salespeople that I knew were among the smartest, savviest, most strategic, most intelligent people who I met in business, and yet other people thought of sales as a totally different kind of profession. And I was like, well, why is there such a gap here? And that's one of the things that I was trying to explore.
Well, by the way, that gap, and I think that that gap still exists today.
Yeah.
And that stereotype still exists in many ways. But boy, what a great articulation of kind of the challenge of professional selling that you'd captured in the book. Really, really loved it. And again, for those who aren't familiar, the story of the last Fuller Brushman, as old Norman Hall continuing on his journey throughout the story of the book, it's just so incredibly interesting. And then it was again the new ABCs of selling, the way you had put them together, so interesting and important today. So
Well, thanks.
so attunement and really being about the client and the customer, that's everything today. We use your stats a lot, by the way, Daniel. The 1 in 9 people in the U.S. in a professional selling job. I
Yep.
believe you'd said 39% of the time, people who aren't selling are trying
Are
to
selling.
persuade. Yeah, are selling.
Right,
Yeah,
right, right.
you're trying to persuade somebody else to their point of view. It's just spectacular work. It's one of the first books we recommend to almost
Oh,
anybody who wants
thanks.
to workshops. So let's fast forward here a little bit to 2022. And now we've got the power of regret, how looking backward moves us forward. And again, thinking about regret, this is probably the only book, folks, that you're going to ever pick up and read that references the Grant study, okay, references an Aesop fable, and also references Scotty P from We're the Millers. So again, just a crazy, crazy, interesting read. What prompted this one this time around?
I had regrets of my own. It's like, I mean, as you're discovering, Mark, there's an adage, especially in social science, but I think it's true among writers, that all research is me search. And so for me, I had some regrets that I was thinking about, and I found that when I was talking to people about them, that they responded in a much more. It's similar to the sales thing. It's like we had the stereotype, oh, you should never talk about your regrets. If you mention your regrets, everyone's going to freak out. They're not going to want to share it. And instead, I got the exact opposite response. I would say, oh my God, you know what? I was thinking about some of my regrets. And people say, oh, really? What are they? What are they? Oh my God, I have them too. And it ended up triggering a very robust conversation. Now, that said, I think I needed, in order to write this book, I think I needed more mileage on me than in my previous books because, I don't think I would have written this book in my 30s. I think this is a book for me that was a better book. I'm more likely to even be able to execute this book in my 50s than in my 30s.
And why is that, by the way? Why would regret sort of, certainly amount of regrets might have added up in terms of time, but why would it resonate so much more now for you versus when you were in your
Well,
50s?
yeah, it's not only the quantity of regrets, it's
Mhm.
also just the overall perspective that you have. That is, regret requires looking backward, and in order for that to be a valuable exercise, there needs to be some amount of distance. And one day I woke up, and to my surprise, there was distance. There hadn't been distance before, and now suddenly there was. But there was also distance in this direction too. There was distance ahead of me, and so I wanted to know, how do I use what I've learned in the past to guide what I'm going to do in the future.
Oh, so interesting. Each chapter's got, some responses of people and their actual regrets because you conducted the 2020 American Regret Project, to begin with 4,489 people, which was, I think, the largest survey on regret ever undertaken. Is that correct, Daniel?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And we did it. We wanted. I mean, one of the. It also. It's so much easier to do that kind of large scale survey research today than it would have been 20 years ago too. Like 20
Right.
years ago, it would have been difficult to pull off, and it would have been, I think, cost prohibitive. Here, it's cheaper and easier. The tools are better. It's much easier to execute. And we went after a very large sample in order to um, be able to weight the sample so that we could look at demographic differences. And it turned out there were not that many.
Hmm. So you end up getting these, amazing responses in 16,000 regrets get identified.
Well,
And
that was another one. So the quantitative one, the American Regret Project, was a quantitative survey, a big public opinion poll, where we could make reasonable claims about demographic differences. Then the other thing that I did was, that first one was quantitative. The second one was qualitative. It's a giant collection tool of regrets from around the world. At this point, Mark, we have over 19,000 regrets from people in 109 countries.
wow,
And that proved to be, yeah, that was just an incredible trove of what the human condition
data.
is all about.
Yeah, data, the human condition here. Let's talk about, first of all, the definition of regret. So Daniel, you said regret is easy to recognize and it's surprisingly difficult to define. So how do we define it?
Well, I think we begin by making sure that understanding that it's an emotion. Okay,
Hmm.
regret is an emotion that we feel, and it's an emotion that makes us feel bad. That's really important. Okay, so it's not like we say we feel regret and it's like, oh my God, that's like experiencing joy or awe or gratitude. No, it's an emotion that makes us feel bad. And the reason that it makes us feel bad is that it's the consequence of looking backward and actually saying, if only I hadn't made that decision, if only I had made another decision, if only I had taken that action, if only I had not taken that action, things would be better today. And so it's backward looking, and it's an emotion that makes us feel bad, and that's why we haven't been able. That's why we often haven't dealt with it properly, because no one ever instructs us how to deal with negative emotions. We think we should either ignore them, and when we can't ignore them anymore, we end up getting captured by them, and too many people wallow in them. But what we should be doing is using these negative emotions as signals, as information, as data, as messages. And when we do that, this is actually an incredibly powerful emotion for understanding what we're about, what we value, what matters to us, and how we can do better in the future.
Hmm. Okay. So you talked about the if only, so the counterfactual there, but there's the other side of that, which is the at least.
Right,
So,
right.
you talked about both sides of the fence. Sometimes we look back and say, well, if only I'd done this. And other times we say, at least this. And there's this amazing example. Go ahead. Sorry, Daniel, you're going to jump in there.
Well, no. You're exactly right. So all of these are categories of counterfactual thinking. That is, again, this is one reason why regret is so cognitively complex, in that it requires a form of mental time travel, and it requires us to rewrite things that really happen. So counterfactual thinking is that we can conjure events that run counter to the facts, things that never happen, things that are in many ways the opposite of what happened. And so there are two kinds of counterfactual thinking. One of them are upward counterfactuals. That's the if onlys. If only I had studied architecture rather than accounting, I'd have a happier profession,
Mhm.
right? If only I had married Bob instead of Fred, I'd be happier today. All right, so that's an upward counterfactual. Downward counterfactuals are when we think about how things could have been worse. So I married that idiot, but at least I have these two great kids.
Mhm.
I should never have taken that job, but at least I met my best friend Marcia. And so here's the thing, though. At least those downward counterfactuals, they make us feel better, and that's okay sometimes. They make us feel better, but they don't make us do any better. If
Oh,
onlys, if onlys make us feel worse, but done right, they help us do better. And in fact, they help us do better because they make us feel worse. And so that's the big distinction. So there's some things in life where actually putting an if only on, putting an at least on it is perfectly fine. But there are many things in life where if you actually want to get better and improve, you want to invite a little bit of that discomfort, invite the if only, invite some of that negativity, because that negativity is going to be the catalyst for improvement.
Fantastic. So, it's interesting. So this was the example you used in the book where you're talking about the women's cycling race back in 2016. I think it was Rio de Janeiro. And, right at the last minute, the order of first, second, and third changes. So there's an American, I think, who was winning and ends up coming up fourth, if I remember this story correctly. And the first three, there's a picture of them that you identify. Obviously, the gold winner, very, very happy. Actually, the bronze winner, very, very happy as well. In the picture you point out, it's an at least I made it to the podium.
Exactly. Unlike that American who finished fourth.
Right. And also unlike the silver medalist, who didn't seem happy in the picture because it was, if only I had a little more gas in the tank, I'd have the gold.
She lost the gold medal by the width of a tire. So if only she had pedaled, if only I had pedaled a little bit harder, I'd be a gold medalist.
Isn't that amazing? Wow. So with all the research you do, you end up breaking down, these regrets, Daniel, into sort of four broad categories: foundation regrets, boldness regrets. I think I have a few of those. Moral regrets. I hope I don't have too many of those. And then connection regrets. That's where the connection in with the grant study is kind of fun. Let's talk a little bit about them because you summarize what they are so nicely. But let's start with foundation regrets.
Foundation regrets are, if only I'd done the work. So these are small decisions that you make early in life that accumulate and have negative consequences later on. So I saved too little and spent too much. Doesn't punish you immediately, but you keep doing it. It causes setbacks. Certain kinds of health decisions, some kind of education decisions, things like that. So that's foundation regrets. Boldness regrets. If only I'd taken the chance. These are people who regret not asking people out on dates, who regret not traveling, who regret not speaking up, who regret not starting businesses. Moral regrets. Moral regrets are if only I'd done the right thing. These are people who are at a juncture in their life. They could do the right thing, they could do the wrong thing. They do the wrong thing, and most of them regret it. It's everything from bullying kids in school to marital infidelity to cheating a business partner, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally are connection regrets, which are if only I'd reached out. These are about the full spectrum of relationships in our life and what happens when those relationships drift apart typically and we don't do anything about it.
Yeah. There were a couple of those that seemed so interesting to me. I love the examples that you bring up, and they seem to tug at the heartstrings, of course, so much. So I think it was the boldness regret where it was Bruce on the train, who had an amazing connection with a young lady he met, and his whole life he's 50 now. He's still thinking of.
He's 60. He's 62.
Oh my God. And, so folks, he meets this young lady on a train in Europe. They have a fabulous connection. She leaves the train and he wishes he followed her, and he still feels the pain of this. And you spoke to him live, I guess, obviously, Daniel. For this.
Oh yeah. Definitely. A couple times. Yeah.
Wow. So it really sort of tugs at the heartstring to think somebody's thinking of this 30, 40 years later. This is one of these boldness regrets where they're still carrying it around. Yeah, talk to me a little bit about how that can't be damaging to someone. So, you talked about, hey, the power of these things can help us moving forward.
Yeah.
Carrying around that regret. Isn't it eating?
Well, the question. So the question is Bruce carrying that around, or is his regret trying to tell him something? Mm-hmm. And so what you want to do is, so I don't want people to carry around their regrets. What I want people to do is meet them and confront them. So if Bruce has this regret, or anybody has this regret that's lasted for 30, 40 years, it's telling you something. It's a signal. And so you don't want to ignore that signal. You don't want to put your fingers in your ears and blot it out. But you also don't want to wallow it and say, oh my God, I'm completely hopeless. I'm the worst person in the world for this. What you want to do is say, what does this signal teach? What is this signal telling me? And I think for Bruce, what it's telling him is that he had a moment in his life when he could have acted boldly and he didn't. And it still bothers him. And now he's not saying that his life would have been perfect had he stepped off that train. But what he's saying is that I had a moment in my life when I could have been bold and I wasn't. And I think that's telling him that he values boldness. He values taking a risk more than he might realize. And that for the rest of his life, he might want to step off the train. Now, it doesn't mean that he doesn't, I'm not suggesting that he leave his wife or, that he have an extramarital affair, but I just think in general, what bugs him is the act itself. He is not saying, oh, if I had stepped off that train, I would have lived my entire adult life in Europe. I'd have this beautiful wife and this past. No, he didn't say that once. It was all about the decision itself. And so the fact that this is, I don't want Bruce carrying it around. What I want Bruce is to listen to it and say, wait a second, Bruce, this has been going on for 40 years. That's a signal. It's a signal that you value boldness. And it's a signal that for the remaining years of your life, and I hope you have plenty of them because you're only 62 years old, that you're going to want to actually step off the train, because I don't want 92-year-old Bruce to have the same kind of regret.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's go over to the connection request. The fourth one you'd identify. You referenced the grant study from Harvard. And for those listening, the grant study was, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a study conducted at Harvard on around 270 people way back in 1938. They tried to follow these people through life for, I think, 70 or 80 years.
Yeah, most of them to their death. Yeah.
Wow. And at the end of it, they were trying to identify triggers for happiness and success. Correct, Daniel?
Yeah. And yeah, right. And what we can think of as flourishing, both professional success and personal success. So it combined is a form of flourishing. But again, you're right. It's like who was happy and who was not.
And what did they find? What was the key findings from that survey?
It was all about, did you have people in your life who cared about you and who you cared about?
Yeah.
That's it. Didn't matter your physical health, didn't matter your marital status necessarily, didn't matter, although that was correlated, didn't matter how much money you had. It was very simple. You have people who you loved and who loved you.
So the fun thing about the book, folks, is when you look back on these things, one of all of these folks who are weighing in with Daniel's survey and coming back saying, listen, my regrets, one of the 4 core categories was about connection. Somebody I lost contact with. The book references a couple of friends from Drake University who were best pals and just lost touch. Nothing significant happened, but they just lost touch. And it seems like there's a fairly clear, sort of message from that area.
Totally.
That says, hey, reach out.
Very clear. Always reach out. I agree with you, Mark. That's a very clear lesson. It's been a very clear, and I say that not outward facing, but inward facing, because it's been a very clear lesson to me. If I'm at a juncture where I'm deciding should I reach out or not, the fact that I'm at that juncture has answered the question. Always reach out. When in doubt, reach out.
Has that changed some of your behaviors, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely.
It has.
I was never very good at reaching out. Reaching out is not my go-to move. And now I'm realizing that's a mistake.
I really like, by the way, about when I was reading the book that touched me was there's this embarrassment, particularly with that. I would say I'm not very good at that either. And had at different points in my life had very large networks, whether it was high school, university, post-university,
right.
different alumni groups of jobs that I've had, and was never really good at reaching out because there's that kind of embarrassment to a certain extent.
Exactly.
Where you feel a bit exposed and you think, reach out, are they going to think I'm needy or it's weird? And I love the way you turned it on its head and reversed it and said, if they reached out to you, would you think it's weird? And the answer of it is no, you'd be delighted they reached out.
Of course, exactly.
So thinking about, wow, okay, let's why don't we show ourselves the same consideration in the opposite? So any other, as we round up on the power of regret here, first of all, folks, fantastic book. And without embarrassing you, Daniel, but I love everything you write. So I've read every book. I think I've read almost everything, almost all of the 7. One of them is my favorite sales book. And you're not a salesperson. You didn't grow up as a salesperson. It's one of my favorite sales books, but they're so incredibly interesting. The writing is spectacular. let me ask you this question. So is there a common theme when I think of Free Agent Nation, A Whole New Mind, Drive to Sell is Human, The Adventure of Johnny Bunko? I'll be honest with you, that book is the one I haven't read, and When, which is amazing. What's the common theme here? How do you pick the books that you're going to go and write next? Like, what drives you to go in one of these seven directions?
Well, that's two different questions about what drives me to go in each direction and whether there's a theme. So on the is there a theme? I don't know. I don't think so. There's not an explicit theme. There's not a theme that I'm pursuing. Not
Okay.
at all. Um, Maybe if you look at them in retrospect, you can concoct a theme. Maybe, I don't know. I just go with writing a book is so difficult. I have to pick something that I'm genuinely interested in, generally want to learn about and figure out myself, and that's a very small number of subjects. Very small number of subjects, and so for me, it's just what am I curious about at that moment. And again, not to get woo woo on you, but who the person I am at that moment is curious about things that the person I was at other moments or will be at future moments might not be. And so
Right.
it's really what is the person that I am at that moment, what is he most curious about? And that's all that there is, because otherwise I probably wouldn't, I'd either write a crappy book or not even be able to write a book if I
What do
don't
you,
deeply care about what I'm writing about. So just to give you an idea, it's like you live with these topics forever. So, for instance, you mentioned Free Agent Nation. I got an email today from a newspaper reporter wanting to talk about Free Agent Nation. I wrote that book 20 years ago. All right,
mm,
so you live with it you live with it, and I'm happy to talk about it. I love talking
yeah.
about it. You live with it for the rest of your life.
What are you curious about right now? What are you interested in right now?
You know what? I'm actually a little bit burnt out right now. I'm trying to. What I need is I need a little bit of time of replenishment. I have a pile of reading and people to talk to, and that's what you know. So I'm not sure exactly at a high level what I'm most interested in. What I am interested in is, I mean, among the things that I'm interested in is I think I'm obviously a little late to the game. I think there's something profound happening in the media landscape right now that might, and what's happened so far in the last 10 or 15 years is only the first stirrings of what's going to happen. So
Mm,
I'm interested in figuring that out. I'm also, as an American, I'm interested I've always been wondering. One of the things that I've changed my mind on is whether there really is, in America at least, equal opportunity, and I'm not
mm,
convinced that there is. And so, what do we do about that? So, those are among the things that I'm interested in.
got it. So Daniel, just circling back on, kind of our themes for the selling well with a couple last questions here. And I know you do master classes and you do work in this area of persuasion. What do you see happening in the world of professional selling these days? So your book was really spectacular. You brought out some almost a common sense revolution in terms of what's going on out there today. But I know you do lots more work on the subject of persuasion. What are you seeing out there today in sales?
Well, I mean, in sales in general, what I'm seeing is the greater and greater sophistication and professionalization of the sales profession. If you look at because all of I mean, and you and your listeners, Mark, already know this, but a lot of the purely transactional stuff is getting completely automated. There's not much juice left in any of that.
Mhm.
And so when you look at especially B2B sales, to me, I've said this before, but B2B sales is management consulting.
Mm,
I don't even consider it B2B sales. I consider it a form of management consulting. And so it requires higher level skills. It requires great relationship building. It requires, I think, incredible analytic sophistication to understand what a business, the customers you're calling on, what their needs are, more important, what their hidden needs are, what problems they might encounter later on, what problems they have that they don't realize what they have. It requires incredible synthesis of information. It requires incredible strategic judgment. I mean, it's essentially management consulting.
boy, I think we would be able to drive a whole lot more interest at the university and college level in this
Absolutely.
business discipline if people understood that
Absolutely.
then instead of now.
I agree
That's
with you. I agree with you. I agree with you, and again, because all of the transactional stuff is getting all this transactional stuff
Yeah.
is getting picked off. It's not about placing phone calls and taking orders and entirely playing a numbers game. That can easily be automated. It requires much more high level human skills, much more high level thinking skills than ever before.
Well said indeed. Hey, Daniel, it's been a real pleasure for me to chat with you here today. But I've been looking forward to this podcast for a long time because being a fan of your books.
Well,
How
thank
do,
you.
how do people get in touch with you outside of buying your books on Amazon? The power of
or from
regret.
any bookseller anywhere in North America.
Yes.
Um, you can go to my website danpink.com. There's a lot of free resources there, discussion guides for the books, information about the books. There's some videos. There's a newsletter, all kinds of stuff. Almost all of it free. I think all of it is free, except if you want to buy the book. Yeah.
Well, listen, Daniel, thank you so much for making time for us today. It's great to meet you.
Mark, thank you for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
See you again.